Good afternoon. It's about 3 p.m. today, and we are here for the May 20th Citywide Advisory Committee meeting, and we still have a couple of people joining, and it looks like we're starting the event with 2 attendees as well. So we will go ahead and save some time at the end for those individuals. I also wanted to reflect a little bit on our agenda for today so everybody knows where we're headed. I believe that we'll have all of our Citywide Advisory Committee members present with the exception of one. So Jessica Aguilar had a conflicting meeting, so she will not be able to join us today, but she will be back with us in June. We have quite a bit to cover today. So we're going to open up and talk a little bit about Module 1. So if there's any residual thoughts in regard to that, then we're going to move on to a presentation and some discussion that's going to really open up that Module 2 discussion regarding design and development standards. So we'll be working on that for the majority of the meeting. And so we'll be asking you really 3 key topics. What are you looking for in those regulations? We'll also talk about some height and transition. And then as I noted, we do have some attendees. So we'll talk about them or talk with them at the end as well, if they'd like to communicate anything with us. And then we also, before the meeting, we had quite a bit of talk about housing affordability and those type of things. So if we have some time at the end, we'd like to talk a little bit about that. And maybe as the group, we can work out some things and kind of comb through some of those details and some of those thoughts that we're all thinking about. I really would like to touch on the city's mission. It's really creating a city for everyone by embracing our community in the decision-making process, innovating and investing to protect our environment, and ensuring a thriving local economy that benefits all. It's always a good reminder to kind of take a look back at what is guiding us, and it's certainly that mission. So we will always look to that to guide us. And then looking at the project goals as well. So making sure that we're implementing our comprehensive plan, which is also called Blueprint Boise, and making sure that we're building upon all of those strategic priorities that we have set before us, creating a city for everyone. So whether that's creating a safe and healthy city, a home for everyone, movement for everyone, a clean city for everyone, opportunity for everyone, and then making sure that we're engaging everyone as well. So we want to make sure that we continually engage our stakeholders and our citizens through the process, making sure that we're getting a really great balance between those traditional Euclidean-based zones, form-based zoning, as well as performance-based zoning, making sure that we're incentivizing and getting great design and a diverse mixture of land uses, improving the user friendliness to make sure that everybody can use the document once we complete it, and making sure we have a streamlined development review process that is both predictable to developers, city staff, as well as all of the residents and visitors of the city of Boise. So our role is really to talk about and think of things as a sounding board for any of these ideas that we're going to come up. All of these ideas then help us draft our upcoming module, which will be module number 2, focusing on those design standards. So we do expect everybody to participate. Some of you do feel comfortable vocalizing your opinion. If not, we do have follow-up surveys, and we encourage you to always fill those out. And you can always reach out to any one of us as well. We'd be happy to take notes, talk to you, work through anything that might be on your mind, those type of things. But as we move forward, we just ask that you be prepared and ready to share all of your thoughts and ideas, really thinking globally about our community. So that going back to that mission of creating a city for everyone, being kind to one another, really actively listening. And so that would include not interrupting others, and then really being ready to learn and do your personal best. So but you guys are a really great group. Oftentimes we don't even have to go over these things, but that's just going to give us a guide of where we're headed today. And we'll set the stage as we start the beginning of topics that are going to lead us to the drafting of Module 2. So with that, I want to go ahead and hand it over to Dawn Elliott, who will be here presenting, and we also have Gabby Hart as well.
So Gabby, could I ask you to share screen? Could you, since you're going to take the first part of this, so nice to see everybody's faces, see their names, and to experience or watch the interaction between all of you in the messages that go back and forth between the meetings. And so it's you guys are tackling some very hard issues that don't have any easy answers. And thanks for the time you put into this effort. Gabby, you ready to share a screen?
Right. Yeah.
Okay. So here's where we are. I'll get you start the presentation mode. Looks like you might have to go down to the bottom and do the presentation mode if you, or slideshow up at the top. Keys, yeah, there we go. Swap it over. There we go. So let's go to the next slide. Okay. We want to talk a little bit about Module 2. Andrea, I didn't know, this is what we're going to cover today, basically. We're going to, as Andrea said, talk about the complexity of the current standards. And then talk about two of the basic things that are of much concern to many people in terms of, besides what use can you do in what district, but the density, the intensity, the form, the fit, and among those, height and transitions of height. So that's kind of where we're going today. Andrea, did you want to set some time aside at the beginning to do our discussion of module or reactions? I think you had 10 minutes set out to do reactions to Module 1, or how would you like to handle that?
Yeah, I think that would be a great opportunity for anybody to talk about some things as they've had time to reflect back or think about things or communicate with their network. We have heard from a number of you through the survey or reaching out. So we have those comments, but if you'd like to talk about anything as a group, this is a great time for opening up that discussion and bringing it forward. So we have a couple of people. So Daniel, do you want to get us started, and then we'll follow up with Chris?
Sure, thanks, Andrew. Yeah, I was sorry to miss the last meeting. And so I just wanted to say a couple things. Again, so impressed with the work that continues to happen by both city staff and the consultant team. So really appreciate all your efforts. There were a couple, topics that I think are probably deserving more discussion, and probably, I don't know that 10 minutes is going to be enough, but so I just want to flag two issues that, and they may come up in Module 2. It was a little unclear for me reading through Module 1, where the edges were. So one topic is just the ADU rules that begin on page 199 of the draft that went out. I think in this draft, you basically have carried forward the city's current policies that were adopted 2 years ago. And I think it just would be good to have a conversation about how well are those rules working? What have we seen? Like, have there been more ADUs? How many more? There are still restrictions in there that ADU advocates, would like to see removed, or some ADU advocates, including me, would like to see removed. And I think it'd just be good to have a conversation about both the owner occupancy requirement, the parking requirements, and the size limitations. I think all of those are functioning as constraints on ADUs, and I think it would be good to get a sense of the group of where we are on that. And I think it would also be great to see some of the data about how, what has changed, because we have 2 years of experience with these new rules, and are we getting the ADU production output that we might hope for our city? So that's one topic. The other topic is, again, in the same section, which goes to under section, I think, F, sort of, which goes to kind of the floor area for duplexes, triplexes in existing residential zones, floor area ratios, setbacks. There's a whole list of kind of conditions that go with those. And I think that's just, and I think that's part of this Module 2 discussion, but I do want to just flag that there are differing views about how to do that, and that certainly other cities step up the FAR with the number of units. We can talk about the pros and cons of that. So those are two discussions that I think don't fit inside of 10 minutes, but I think it would be good for us to have, because I think they will really be important in terms of how they affect what comes out of this.
That is great information. And what we can do to help facilitate some of that is to actually give you some data. So taking a look at how many ADUs we do approve. So we actually revamped the ADU code just recently. So it was about a year ago that we visited that. It went through a lengthy public process. And
Andrew, I think it was 2 years. I think you adopted it in 2019.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so it's relatively recent, but we can look at some of those numbers and get them to you, how many we were approving prior to that, how many we've approved since that, and get you some information, and then also look at some of that information, and we can bring it back for discussion. And we can do the same for duplexes as well. So that was actually recently revamped as well. So we just added some open space requirements, trying to be consistent with the substandard lot ordinance that is currently in existence and those types of things. So we can certainly look at that as a group. And so I'll get you some information for the next meeting, and then hopefully we can start to talk about some of those things as well. All right, Chris.
Hi. So my question is hopefully relatively quick. So looking through module 1 and then also just like looking on the city website, I'm wondering when we're going to see maps of the zones. So we have like the new zones sort of listed out and sort of the changes to that, but the maps that exist on the city website are still the current zoning code. So I'm curious, since I didn't find any maps, if any, one, do exist, or two, when we can expect that to happen. So I'm especially interested in the mixed use zoning and how that's expected to change, because I imagine that especially along like transit corridors and in some of these transition areas, that there will be a change in zoning to represent some of these mixed use zones. And so I'd like to see what areas are sort of being targeted for that, if that's already been decided or if that's still an upcoming discussion that we haven't had yet.
Andrea, can I tackle that one?
You betcha.
So we've the question has come up earlier. You're not the first to ask and say, wow, it's kind of hard to visualize what's people have in mind without a map. We have advised that the earliest we would recommend that you do that is after module 2 goes public, because right now there is no map. I haven't drawn a map. I don't think staff's drawn a map. But if we did draw a map and said, well, this is how you should think about it when you read module 1 and you're looking down this column, where would it apply? The first question that's going to come up is, well, how tall would it be? How much parking would that require? How much of the lot can it cover? Does it have to be close to the street? And those are module 2 questions. And so in our experience, you kind of have to have in your hands a proposal, even though it's just a proposal. It's a draft that talks about uses and form and landscaping and parking, because that way people can stare at it and they can have an answer to their question. Oh, they're talking about 5-story buildings in that area. They're only talking about 2-story buildings in that area. And so our suggestion, the third module is on process, and process doesn't affect who can do what, where, with what quality standards. And so we think you could have a discussion of that as early as when module 2 goes out, but we've suggested to the city that you not do it before that.
Thank you.
And then we have Roberta.
Hi, Andrea, Nell, and everyone else. It is a short time to comment, so I will be brief. I did submit some comments for module 1. My question or comment really has to do with the public engagement process and educating the public as to this entire process for rezoning. And I appreciate the information that you sent out about all the opportunities the public would have. But also, in our meetings, we have the opportunity or the recognition of the fact that this is a really big picture process. But with the people I talk to and some of the sessions I've listened to outside of this group, what comes down to is people want to know how it's going to impact them, not the city, but how it's going to impact them. which Chris's comment about maps fits into my thoughts. This whole process reminds me of how a bill becomes a law. It's a real sausage making process. And I would like to suggest, and maybe if there's time now or some point in the future, how do we explain this process better to folks who are not involved in this committee? That it's, why the modules are designed like they are. Don just addressed why the maps aren't out there yet, because, where I live is different than where people in the Northwest or the Southwest live, which are not as developed as my environment. So, I'm really hoping that we have an opportunity in the future as to how we could better communicate this entire process, whether it be from the city or from us as Citizen Advisory Committee members. Don's shaking his head, but I don't know what that means.
I would, Andrea, I figured that Andrea or Deanna would address that in terms of the plans for outreach, but it's a great comment. It's my only comment would be, it's a very thoughtful comment. I'm sure it's on many people's minds. Keep in mind, there are 4 parts of this. Each one gets a comment, and when the whole picture is put together, there's another round of comment. We need, I think your point goes, yeah, there's some logic to that, but the public may not understand that, or they have not had a chance to understand the flow of it, and the fact that they don't see why the gears are turning in the way the gears are turning doesn't mean that it's a backdoor deal, that in fact there's a logic behind it that could be explained to the public. I think that's your point, and I agree. So.
It is, and I'll just tag on to that a little bit. As a former government employee involved in NEPA, it's the process is like, and my apologies to anybody who's a vegan, making sausage, and it's just very complicated. So when I try and share to folks what's going on, the questions that come back to me in my small little group and then to others I listen to, well, what about affordable housing, which reflects a lot of the emails? And what about parking? And what about this? And what about that? And I'm cognizant now more so than ever that rezoning isn't going to address all of our problems, but I think that needs to be communicated as part of this process. And now I'm done.
Okay.
Yeah, and those are really great comments. And Roberta, you and I had an opportunity to chat about that yesterday and or the day before. And I think that those are all really great. So we're taking those into consideration and trying to figure out the best way to communicate to everyone so that they understand that there are multiple opportunities for them to participate throughout the process. And then at the end too, once we consolidate all of those draft modules, which will be 3, there'll be additional opportunity to comment as well. And then we'll, also try and utilize normal language and try not to use difficult terms that are very technical, because oftentimes people don't understand what technical terms are unless you are in the business. So really communicating to people clearly and concisely. And so we'll continue to do that. So if you have additional comments in regard to that, always let us know, because we can certainly do that as well. So we'll go ahead and update some of our materials to make sure that we're reaching as many people as we can most effectively.
And I'll add one more thing. So I lie. I'm making up for my lack of verbal communications in the past. And that is how do we become more engaged, or how do you as the city and the consultants or my colleagues in this volunteer committee, how do we do a better job in communicating this? Because I think we're all coming from our own perspective, like why I got onto this committee or why so-and-so got onto this committee. And I hope that we could have a more detailed conversation amongst ourselves at some point as to how we could help this process move along. Because my idealistic little world, I hope that we're all here for a unified outcome.
Absolutely. And so as a member of the Citywide Advisory Committee, we just ask that you share what you're doing with others, direct them to the website, let them know about all the opportunities that they have. So whether it's signing up for our newsletter and email list, participating in one of our community conversations, filling out a survey, those types of things. And we're doing our best as well to get out on social media, to do interviews with some of our news outlets, those types of things as well. So just share that information openly and freely. And if they have questions, you can always direct them back to us. If you don't feel comfortable answering those questions, direct them to our website. Really just get them involved in the process or interested. Oftentimes that's the first step. So,
Thanks.
yeah. And it looks like that's all that we have about Module 1. Did anybody else have any final comments?
Shellen, I think, put a comment in the chat box saying, could you tell them the quote unquote deadline for comments to Module 1?
Yes. So ultimately, we would like to have preliminary comments by June 1. Now, that is just to get us in that really good standings and good footings to understand the big things that people are concerned about. But as we go through the process, you're going to notice things that maybe they don't jive. Maybe they conflict with one another, those types of things. So you always have the ability to provide us comments. So you can provide us comments via email. You can give us a telephone call and we'll take notes. You can put that in those surveys that you receive at the end of our Citywide Advisory Committee meetings. Or if you have a hard copy and you have notes or sticky notes, whatever that is, however you edit best or communicate best, that's the way to do it. So just get that to us and we'll make sure that we as a project team have that information, as well as the Clarion consulting team as well.
And I would just say that's for the benefit of people. The comment in the chat box was she's deadline driven. She just needs to have a date. I'm the same way. Tell me when I have to get it done. But I want to be clear. If you show up in November with a comment on Module 1, it will be taken seriously. Earlier is better. And if you show up before, when the consolidated draft is out with a comment that says, I've just been sweating this, or I missed it before, this is wrong, we ought to change it. It will always be taken seriously. Let me give you an example though. If the earlier we get the comments on uses in districts, the faster we can roll it into our thinking. If everybody hates X and doesn't think it should be allowed in Boise at all, consultants shouldn't be spending a lot of time thinking through the parking standards for X because it's kind of a waste of time. And so that's an extreme example. That doesn't happen. But my point is, the more we can get sense, Andrew can get a sense, this is still up in the air, the better we can let that guide how much time and energy we put into fleshing out Module 2 and down the road and say, we got to think about it. Maybe this one's going to go away. Maybe we shouldn't spend so much time on it right now because it's still debatable as to whether this is going forward.
Oh, and we have one hand raised from Brad Nielsen as well. So let's hear from Brad before we move on.
Hey, everybody. I guess Dawn just kind of answered what I was thinking here is like this Module 1, is this set in stone or do we have still some flexibility here? Because, I'm not agreeing with consolidating and loosening up the restrictions on some of these protected areas. So, I just want to know that we can still, correct some of this. And on another point is the communication that we've had, there really hasn't been any outside of this group. I know I've sent out some stuff and I always wait till the last minute to do it. And then we get a little bit of reaction from it. But, if everybody's on, what are we doing here? What's the point? Do I need to show up if we've already decided all this? So thanks.
Well, Brad, it hasn't been set in stone, and I thought I had been clear about that, but I'm happy to repeat it. Nothing has been set in stone. The nature of zoning work is that you can't agree on things verbally. There are too many details and nuances. You can't say in a group of 20 people, well, I would agree with proposition X as long as A and B and C were true. And then somebody says, well, I don't agree with C or B, but I agree with A. Can't do it. You have to put it in writing. All this reflects is that having done the outreach we've done and had the discussions we've done, staff approved us to say, this is good enough for public discussion. This is what we are willing to say, this is out there for public discussion. I will tell you that in my experience in the course of this work, that use table will be changed multiple times along the way because people will have comments on it. But be prepared that what usually happens is you get comments saying, that's the worst idea since sliced bread, get it out of there. And you get other comments saying, that's the best thing I ever heard, keep it in there and strengthen it. And staff has to take all of those and try to figure out, okay, so how do we figure this out? And how do we explain how we figured that out? And I'll tell you in advance, I think their main thing is going to be, well, which set of comments will bring us closer to the Blueprint Boise vision? That's where we got to go. But I guess my point is, it's not at all set in stone. There are going to be 3 more comprehensive rounds for comments. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's one after that as part of phase 4. It often happens. You put it all together, you go out for comment, people make a bunch of comments, you change it. And then they want to see it again and comment again. Now, I'm not committing Boise to that, but they've built a lot of time into the end of this process in expectation that that will happen. That in fact, despite multiple rounds of comments on the modules, there will be additional comments on the consolidated draft, and there will probably be continued discussion after that needs to be sorted out before this moves forward. So, Brett, it is nothing, none of this has been set in stone. It's just the nature of zoning work that you have to put it in writing. And even though you may not agree with it, the effort that's been put on the table so far is an attempt to balance the competing comments we've heard back and forth. It isn't all on one side or all on the other. It's an attempt to balance that. And your comments make clear, and I'm not surprised. I think a number of people say, well, it doesn't reflect the balance I would have liked to see you say. But that's how the process works.
All right. And so always keep in mind, if you have thoughts, go ahead and send them in however you find it easiest to do for you. And then we'll let Dawn go ahead and take it away and give us our presentation.
I will, and let me just lay a little foundation. Gabby is going to handle the first part of this presentation. We're going to talk a little bit about the timeline for Module 2, just as we talked about the timeline for Module 1. In an earlier thought process, we had allowed less time for Module 2. We argued and we agreed with the city that you need more time. So many people, and even in the chat box today, have said, I have a hard time reading Module 1 without Module 2. And among the many things that people care about are height, density, form, lot coverage. What does it look and feel like? Yeah, okay, I can't visualize this use until I know how big it's going to be. So this whole session is about that. There's a lot more in Module 2 that we'll cover in June and July. This one we've asked, and I guess I'll just say the words, we're going to slow down because the dimensional standards are complicated. Some of you eat and breathe this and understand it before you woke up this morning. And because this group has been created with a wide divergence, a wide diversity of opinion, including people who do not spend their lives looking at zoning ordinances at all and don't speak the language, probably, we're going to slow down because it's important to understand the various moving pieces of this. And if we rush through it, there are going to be people saying, you lost me at 3:30 and I couldn't follow what was going on after that. And so the first part of this is to talk about how we're going to go about Module 2 and then to present the tools, the toolbox of things that cities use to govern form, height, density, intensity, floor area ratio, just to try to see if we can get a foundation of that people understand what those terms are. And also an understanding that using a whole lot of tools makes the code very complicated. And then we're going to ask some key questions related to it. So we're going to do kind of, how do you think about this? What do the terms mean? Then some trends, then some key questions for discussion. So Gabby, would you take it from here?
Sure. Thanks, Don. So just as a reminder of where we're at in the larger zoning code rewrite process, we have the public draft of Module 1 posted and available for comments. And now we're shifting into Module 2, the design and development standards, which is what we're talking about today. So looking into our actual meetings for the next few months, today we're talking about lot and building dimension and building form standards. Then in June, we'll move into subdivisions, sensitive lands, access and connectivity. In July, we'll talk about parking, landscaping, lighting, and all of the other development standards and the design standards. And then in August, we'll give the presentation and review of the draft of Module 2. So as usual, we wanted to frame this conversation around the policy directions given in Blueprint Boise. And these are related to development standards as a whole, as well as specifically the dimensional and the building form topics that we're talking about today. So the plan calls for compact and walkable development that supports transit, transitions between non-residential or higher intensity residential and the adjoining neighborhoods, and to ensure that infill and redevelopment within established neighborhoods is compatible and uses zoning tools like building heights and setbacks to ensure that compatibility. So before we get into our discussion questions, it's important that we walk through some of the basics of these dimensional and form standards. And like Dawn mentioned, after we get through this and the next slide, we'll pause to see if anyone needs any clarification on the actual concepts or terms, because like Dawn said, we know not everyone here lives and breathes zoning, but since we do, we're happy to answer those questions. And that way, when we get into the discussion, we can all be on the same page. All right. So historically, zoning ordinance have used a variety of tools to ensure that new development and redevelopment fits into either the existing development pattern or a desired development pattern for the area. So here is a long list of typical tools used in zoning codes, and I'll briefly touch on each of them. So the first one is minimum lot size and width requirements. And these are probably familiar to see or to hear about. And it's how many total square feet a lot can be. And then lot width is the horizontal length of the lot as it faces the street. So many communities are actually repealing these two standards in mixed use and special purpose districts, including for multifamily development, because they've found that minimum lot sizes can unintentionally limit or effectively prohibit the desired types of development. However, in low density residential districts, it's common to keep lot size and width. But there are a few communities that have gotten rid of the minimum lot size requirement and only have a minimum lot width requirement so that the street appearance of the lot is consistent with the surrounding properties, but the lot size itself does not have to match. Next on the list is residential density, which is usually measured in maximum dwelling units per acre. And this is another standard measure to include, but in communities that are more concerned with form, they're sometimes being replaced with more form-based standards like building types that say, here's the type of building that fits in here, and we're not going to limit you to a maximum number of dwellings so long as you fit this building type. And next is maximum development intensity, which is sometimes regulated by floor area ratio, but I'm actually going to wait until the next slide to talk about that one. So then next are building setbacks, which determine where the building can be placed on the lot. And I'll also touch on those in more detail in a minute, but often it's the front setback in particular that is most important in maintaining neighborhood character. And then the rear setbacks are important when it comes to maintaining privacy between lots. Next on the list is build to lines. So instead of how far set back your building has to be, this establishes how close the building needs to be to the street. These are increasingly common in mixed use and other special purpose districts, especially in more form-based codes, and they're not commonly used for residential districts. And build to lines help create a more pedestrian friendly and active street frontage. And then the next two tools are maximum lot coverage and minimum usable open space. Lot coverage is how much of your lot can be covered by buildings, parking areas, sidewalks, etc., versus usable open space, which can be defined differently depending on the community. But generally speaking, the key word there is usable. So things like outdoor seating areas, a landscaped courtyard, and patios would be usable open space versus a small strip of landscaping between the building and the sidewalk would not be considered usable. So just because there's not a building on it does not make it usable open space. And increasingly, newer codes are removing usable open space or lot coverage requirements, recognizing that these are things that often preclude some more affordable housing types. However, we do want to mention that in a previous conversation with you, all related to amenities for PUDs, it was clear that for Boise, affordable housing shouldn't come at the expense of open space on a site. So removing those standards may not be a good approach for Boise. And that's the advantage of having such a large toolbox of these things, is that we can find the best solution for Boise. And the final tool, which is probably one of the most familiar and recognized zoning tool, which is maximum building heights. Minimum building heights are unusual to see except in more intense mixed use districts. A number of new form-based codes try to force a minimum height of 2 stories, for example, which is a common height in establishing a specific street character in more urban areas. But I've also learned that when you go above 2 stories, you often have developers that can't finance a larger building like that. So it's something that Boise would need to carefully consider. It has a long-term benefit of ensuring that specific areas are not underbuilt, but then there's also the potential that you might be excluding a certain development that could positively contribute to an area, but that a developer can't afford to build when there's those requirements. And that's all to say that most zoning codes don't use all of the tools listed here, because with every additional standard you apply to a lot, there's an additional layer of complexity, and that contributes to increasing development costs. So to get into just a little more detail, first about FAR. So FAR, floor area ratio, was developed primarily for suburban greenfield development. And it turned out actually to be a good way to measure traffic generation so that traffic engineers could look at raw land, and before a particular development was planned, you could run the numbers about the kind of traffic that might be produced based on the type of development that was being proposed and see if the roads could handle it. But it's generally not an ideal way to regulate urban development because it still leaves unpredictability about the mass and the scale of the structure that could be built. So if you look at this graphic, you can see that 3 very different building forms are placed within the same lot area based on a 0.5, 1, and 2 floor area ratio. And later in the presentation, Dawn is actually going to talk about some other tools that are being used to regulate development intensity instead of FAR. And then finally, for setbacks, we just wanted to point out that the front and rear setbacks run from side to side on the lot. And then the side yard setbacks make up the space in between those two. So there are often separate requirements for corner lots, since one of the sides of their lot actually faces a street. And these are 2 graphics that illustrate that concept. So before we move into our first discussion question, does anyone need any clarification on any of the concepts or terms mentioned on these? And I cannot see hands or anything. So Andrea, if you could help me out here.
We have a hand from Chris.
So I just wanted to clarify that based on the list of tools and descriptions from that previous slide, that I'm right in interpreting that different zones and areas are likely going to have different tools from this list applied. So there will be different tools used in low density versus high density residential versus mixed use versus commercial, that each of the zones will have their own sort of mix of these tools.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. I want to say one more word before we move on. Just Gabby did a great job, but just while we're staring at FAR, again, for those of you who didn't wake up saying FAR in the morning, it's the ratio of the square footage in the building, which is, it could be on several floors, but it's the total of all the square footage of all the floors of the building compared to the square footage of the lot on which it's placed. Which is why that first example says, well, if it's 0.5, your building could have half as many square feet in it on a one-story building as there are square feet on your lot. That's a 0.5 FAR. But if you look to the right of that, but it could be 2 stories that occupy 1/4 of your lot. And so that's when we talk about FAR, floor area ratio, the ratio of the floor area of the building to the lot on which it is placed. So, yeah. Brad, get your hand up.
Brad?
Sorry, guys, I got a phone call there, I'm trying to get away from, but how does this apply to this bonus density? It doesn't seem like this is happening in these high density subdivisions that are 5 feet apart. How does that work with this this formula here?
Well, we're trying to explain the basic tools here. Some of the existing developments were approved with, could you go back to one slide, Gabby? So different developments currently were approved with different combinations of these rules. And when the city approves a development, it's one of 2 things. It either in that zone district, there is a set of tools, not all of these tools. Some of them are in that existing district in which that development took place in Boise. And it qualified. That's option A, is it qualified? And it said the side setback is 5 feet. If you want to know why the buildings are 5 feet apart, it's because the zoning code said you can be 5 feet apart. Now, I will say by point of reference, it probably seems very crowded to people who haven't seen it. The building code is different from the zoning code. Building code has to do with fire safety and structural integrity. Will this building stand up and last long enough to not hurt the people in it and be safe from fire and not spread the fire to the next building? In most fire codes allow a 5-foot setback without having fire rated walls or extra construction. So when you say, that's outrageous, it's a character discussion that the city approved. The city approved it. And when they ran it by the fire marshal, usually the fire marshal says, works for us. That is a national fire safety standard. It could have been 10 feet or 15 feet or 20 feet. And sometimes they are that much. But I guess the answer to your question, Brad, is either that development that you have in mind met the combination of dimensional standards that applied in that zone district, or the city approved negotiated zoning. The developer came in and said, I know what the rules are, but I want a different deal. And here's usually what I'll give you in return for that deal: open space or amenities or infrastructure or something. And the city, that's a PUD, that's a planned development, and that is legalized, negotiated zoning. And it's legal because they took it all the way up and city council said, yep, we'll do that. And so, so it was a deal. They're your elected leaders, and even if the district said 10 feet, I'm making up this example, said 10-foot side setbacks. The guy said, I need 5 to make this work. City engaged in negotiations, and at the end of it, they said, we'll approve 5. Is the short answer to it, is that the combination of different tools that apply in that district, which are not all of these, I guarantee you, probably, allowed that to happen. Are there any other questions just about the tools? We're going to refer to these in terms of trends as to where some things are going, and then ask you questions about, what Blueprint Boise clearly says. We want things to fit in. How do we best think through that issue? We're going to ask you those questions, but before we do, any more questions about setbacks? FAR. Okay. All right. Let's go on then. So I do want to say this. This is the question. This is the first question before we take a short break. Boise's current residential zone district dimensional standards control the following things. So we showed you a list just for vocabulary, so you would know before we plow into a very technical topic, who the players are, who's on the court. You control minimum lot size, minimum lot width, street frontage, which is often a different measure, meaning how much of the building needs to come up to the front of the lot and occupy the front of the lot. Open space on per lot. How much open space do you need on your development lot? And all of these differ district to district. It's not one size fits all. It's a separate set of rules, often more than one option within a zone district. But this is the things that you're controlling: minimum lot size, minimum lot width, street frontage, open space on the lot, front, side, rear setbacks. These are minimums. That's the list of minimums. You got to do at least this. And just to conceptualize this, what this is you take a square piece of paper, like a piece of paper, and the developer says, well, what could I put on this lot? Well, the paper's got to be at least this big before I can build on it. If it could be smaller, I could get more of them, but it has to be at least this big and this wide. Okay, that's my piece of paper. Sure help me if the paper was smaller. No, that's the size of paper you got to work with. Lot and street frontage, open space. Okay, I got to take out the following amount of open space. That's off the table because somewhere on this lot, I got to keep it out open for usable open space. And the front, side, and rear setbacks. Okay, I can't draw on the first 3 inches of the paper. I can't draw on the back 2 inches of the paper. I can't draw on the right and left sides of 1 inches of the paper. And then if you turn the paper sideways and say, well, what can I do? Maximum height and lot coverage says, okay, maximum height says, well, whatever you build, it's got to be no taller than this. And lot coverage says, and the footprint of the building can't exceed this percentage of the whole lot. So those are maximums. That's why we listed them separately. You kind of figure out what portion of the piece of paper you can draw your development on. And the maximums say, okay, you got that? Now you can't go above X, and you also can't cover more than Y. And it very commonly happens that, and I'm just laying this out so you understand how it works. The guy says, wait a minute, after setting aside the open space and the setbacks, I started with the right lot size, I set back the setbacks, and I put out the open space, and I've got X left to build on. But the lot coverage says you can only cover 0.75 of X. And the developer says, why? And the answer, I gave you the open space you wanted. And the codes say, in addition to usable open space, that there'll be things that you can actually use on this site. We don't want it all covered with tarmac and buildings. We want rainwater to be absorbed into the soil, and we want it open. So in addition to an amount of space that is supposed to be usable for things that are not 3 feet wide and all the way down the lot that's not really usable, we do want a percentage of the lot to remain uncovered for character, or for open space, or for rainwater infiltration. The more rainwater goes into the ground, the less has to go into pipes. That's a good thing in many places. So that's what's for control. And I guess the question we just wanted to throw out, I see we have 2 hands, is let's talk about residential right now, because I think it's of much concern to many folks on this group. Downtowns and activity centers, we can talk through separately. Let's try to focus the discussion on residential. When you think of your neighborhood and what it means to fit in with your neighborhood, which of these is most important? If you say all of them, then you say all of them. But from a builder's point of view, it's difficult because each regulation shrinks the envelope of things that you can do. And unintentionally, that tends to drive up housing costs. So we need to talk about it. So I don't know who had their hand up first. Andrea, did you or does
Yeah,
it
let's
matter?
start with Ian and then we'll follow up with Byron and then Patrick.
Great. So this is a difficult question. I don't think there is probably any right answer. From my point of view, from an architectural point of view, I'm gonna pick a few and kind of say it's a combination of them.
Mhm.
I think it's probably a little bit of everything. It's, your setbacks that kind of maintain open space, like Don was saying, and then it's kind of a combination of your height and FAR. Thinking back to previous discussions we had on this group about compatibility of buildings, and discussions I've had with some of my coworkers, that they live in neighborhoods, the neighborhood has this character, and then somebody built it's a 2-story house. Their house is a 2-story, but the floor to floor heights are, much higher. And so maybe they're a taller house and it doesn't, windows don't quite align. It doesn't quite fit in. So those are, I guess, kind of what I'm leaning towards. I do think that there's something there for open space and open, not paved area, how that factors in, if it's open space or how you define that, I think is important as well.
Okay. Byron?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Dawn. I think neighborhood character is such a slippery, term, because it's been weaponized by neighborhood groups and others, I think, to try to avoid or redirect the conversation around change and growth in given neighborhoods. But in my experience, I work on preservation projects, historic preservation projects. And in my experience, the A and B are far more critical questions in suburban development. It has kind of more to do with development form and the age in which those neighborhoods were built. Suburban neighborhoods, especially the ones that were built in the mid-century onward, are far more interested in uniformity. And so A and B are more critical in those areas, where our gridded neighborhoods like the North End, the East End, the Boise Central Bench, those areas were designed in a modular fashion with modular, lot sizes and alleyways. Those can more gracefully integrate a variety of housing types and I guess give a little bit more granularity to the kind of designs that are possible to be placed in those neighborhoods and still be able to fit in. So it's less a question really of A and B, in my opinion, for our established neighborhoods, our old gridded neighborhoods, because the ability for those to accommodate a variety of changes just seems to be a lot more readily available.
Okay, thank you. Patrick, I think you're up.
Great. When I review the list here, I try to view it through the frame of, okay, if one of these was completely disregarded and people went as a relatively extreme as you might think would be possible, what would be most jarring to somebody compared to the rest of the neighborhood? And I kind of settle on front setbacks. Like if they went all the way up to the sidewalk in a place where they were typically 20 feet back, would be more potentially jarringly different than most of the other ones. There's, as Byron mentioned, there's a lot of places with a variety of lot widths that can vary quite a bit. Street frontages can vary quite a bit. On lot open space, also highly variable in a lot of places. And the neighborhood still has a congealed feel. Really, so if I was going to say one of them, probably the front setback, and I'm sure at some point height would be as well. Not that I think all of them need to be the same height, but 30 stories in a traditional 2-story neighborhood, that would also be one. But I do think some flexibility in height's okay as well. But I'll say the front setback.
Okay. Let's just give it another minute. Once again, the point was, and this is good feedback. This is good feedback. Patrick's question is a good one. It's one that planners ask themselves. Over time, codes get more complex. People add regulations. There's something bad built, or people don't like it, so they add a regulation. This is your once in a generation time to say, okay, which don't we need? which could we do without? It's hard, once you're used to using something, it's hard to imagine without it, but I will tell you there are, and Gabby said, there are things on here that some cities upon reflection are saying, that would be one less box to check, and we think it would not change the nature of the neighborhood. Richard.
Yeah, thanks. Listening to Byron and Patrick made me think a little bit. Yeah, it'll be interesting if we can differentiate in some way, even though we may have the same zoning districts between, out where I live versus, near, greenfield development versus, in towards that grid structure. I was thinking, I would agree with Patrick in a lot of places, the front setback is probably going to be important, but kind of out here, it seems I kind of would say it would be the reverse, and the rear setback is kind of the most important because that's where so many things of the more traditional and by traditional here, I'm really predating that mid-century suburbia feel, but still small farmstead type building and character to the extent that can be remain somewhat intact, both for historical and many other reasons. It's maybe kind of the rear setback becomes pretty important. So not to say that I disagree with Patrick. I think probably a lot of places that would make more sense, the front, but in the kind of more agricultural areas, that rear setback does get kind of important. I personally don't care how close somebody is to the street, but that's me. Anyway, thank you.
Well, you raised a good point, though, because the reason, Patrick, between the two of you, you raised the two arguments why setbacks haven't gone away. Front setbacks have to do with street character. You just heard Richard doesn't think it's that important, but some people do, and other people say it is the back setback because I don't actually want my neighbor looking out his second floor window into my backyard. It's a privacy issue back here, and so yes, it's an affordability issue. I will say that many communities are allowing more of the lot to be covered to allow more housing, and they are doing that, but it always faces this issue. Well, I don't want to expand my house. I don't want to redevelop my house. And I frankly don't want my neighbor looking over into my backyard. And so that's one of the reasons why backyards remain a topic for the reason I think Richard was hinting at. But yeah, Brad?
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about these older style neighborhoods. They don't seem to exist anymore, and it doesn't seem like we're even trying to create such thing. We've got all these houses packed together with no front yard or backyard, and people are hanging out in their garages. It seems like, that's where you party nowadays, is in your garage.
Well, Brad, I fully.
Go ahead. I've lost my point, I think.
Well, Brad, I don't think you've made your point a couple times. I think you are dubious about the value to Boise. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think what you're saying is you're dubious about the value to Boise of very closely packed subdivisions. You've raised it 2 or 3 times, whether this is a good thing going forward. It's happening because the city approves it, and it happens because whatever the land developer paid for the land has to be divided among the houses that they sell. And when you put more houses closer together, you can divide what is often extremely expensive land costs over more houses and bring them in at a lower price point. If you don't, and you say, no, we would like to have, historically, I'm making this number up. Historically, we had 10-foot setbacks. Let's stick with that. Let's stick with 50% lot coverage and 10-foot setbacks. That's what made Boise great, and let's stick with that. That is a choice you can make. The issue is now the very expensive land costs are being divided over fewer houses, and those fewer houses are going to cost more. That's why it's happening. So,
seems like what made Boise great is disappearing, if not gone already.
Yeah.
All we want to do is stuff more people in here, and I just don't understand that, and that's my whole reason for being here. I don't know why we have to stuff so many people into Boise. If you look at Nampa and Caldwell, I think they're slowing down on stuff because they just don't have the infrastructure to keep bringing people in. How we we don't have enough fire stations. We don't have enough water. We don't have enough doctors. I just don't understand why we keep wanting to stuff people in here.
Well, Brad, the short answer is you can't stop them. They're either going to live in Boise or going to live outside of Boise. And we talked about that little while ago, that I think in Blueprint Boise, and like many other cities, they had a hard discussion at the time the plan was made and said there are downsides to having more people in the city, and there are downsides to forcing them out of the city. We can go through them again if you want, but if you don't accommodate them in the city, they live nearby the city because the city's got the jobs. And then
Yeah,
they're
I
driving on the
understand
same streets with their.
sprawl. Yeah,
I understand.
I
That's
understand it.
that's the only adage. The only thing Americans hate worse than density is sprawl. Or you can flip it around. The only thing Americans hate worse than sprawl is density. They're both true. So I'm sorry to go off on that tangent, but I was trying to be responsive to. You're making a very consistent point, which we do understand. Any other comments before we move on?
Marissa has made a comment. She wasn't quite sure how to raise her hand, but she would like to vote and say that height and rear setback are both important for both privacy of both for the existing neighbor's privacy. So,
Andrea, I think in light of I'd like to do a couple more slides and then we'll take a 5-minute break, but we have 2 topics to talk about that are directly related to this intensity setbacks form question. And then we know that there's a background discussion on affordable housing. And in addition, to save a little time for that at the end and plus public comment, is it okay with you if we move on at this point?
absolutely, but we want to make sure that everybody's had an opportunity to share with us, are there any important components that we have existing that are really important to you? So if anybody hasn't had an opportunity to share, let's talk about those things. And if not, then let's go ahead and talk about those next few slides before we enter our break. Well, I don't see anything. So go ahead, Don.
All right, Gabby, there are only 2 slides, there are only 2 slides here before our break, but I did want to talk about this. One is, look at the first bullet, then don't look at the graphic yet. I'll talk about that in a minute. The first bullet is basically FARs, floor area ratios, and are increasingly not used as measures of intensity in newer codes. If you are a pure form-based code believer, remember we talked about this 2 or 3 times over the past 4 or 5 months, then you believe the building form and its fit and flexible uses within that building form are how you govern a great city. And if you buy that, or to the degree you're on the spectrum saying that matters more to me, many newer codes are saying we're not measuring FAR anymore. Because it could lead to a 1-story building over the whole lot, or a 2-story building over half the lot, or a 4-story building over a quarter of the lot, or an 8-story building. We don't know what we're going to get. It is a measure of traffic generation, as Gabby said, better than it is intensity. So there are many cities that have this discussion and decide to keep it. And there are many cities that have this discussion and say, we don't want to do this. We are going to try to lean on the form side, whether it's setbacks, as Brad has said, or closeness to the street, or whatever it is, how much of your lot you can cover, how tall the building can be. And we're going to say, you make your building in that envelope, in that form, with that location on the site. And we are not going to count the square footage of the floor area compared to the lot. Matter of fact, we're not even going to count dwelling units per acre. We're just not going to do it. We're going to lean more towards the fabric and less on the intensity. Most of them still say the more units you put in there, the more parking you're going to have. I mean, you could repeal parking. There have been strong arguments been made. Nobody's dwelt on that, and we'll talk about that down the road in a couple of meetings. But the point is, if people do say, I'm not going to measure FAR anymore, they usually do say, but the more you put in here, the more you're going to have to accommodate it in parking. So it is not like, well, we don't care completely. The second thing I wanted to show you is contextual setback, and several of you have brushed up against this. The example on the right is just a diagram that was in our files. Increasingly, especially for older neighborhoods, codes are saying your front setback is either the average on your block face, or it is or somewhere between your neighbor to the left and your neighbor to the right. We don't have a number in mind. This neighborhood was built, and those are contextual setbacks. the diagram just shows you front setback, but we have seen, and I have drafted codes that say the side setbacks are also contextual. So if your neighbors could have built to 5 feet from the lot line, but they decided to build 10 feet from the lot line and use up less of their lot, and everybody did that, or the developer did that, and you buy a lot, you're going to have to do it. Or the law said, well, everything was built with 5-foot setbacks, and then somebody wrote the zoning ordinance and it says 10 feet, but nobody complies. When you buy a lot, you're going to have to match your neighbors. That the law is the fabric of your neighbors. And this could apply to front setbacks, side setbacks, rear setbacks, lot size. We've actually had places saying, if you can buy 10 lots, but if the truth is all your neighbors bought 2 lots and built 1 house on 2 lots just because they're small old lots and they only developed at half the density, you got to do that too. You can't do 10 houses on 10 lots. You look up and down your block and you do what your neighbors did to fit in with the character of the neighborhood. That is, those are all contextual standards. We've even seen some say the mass of the house has to be close to your neighbors. I once wrote a code that says when you tear down a house and build a new house, it cannot be less than 75% as big as the house that was your neighbors on that block, and it can't be more than 125%. We are not interested in McMansions next to bungalows. We are going to say, buy it accordingly. This neighborhood wants to have contextual building massing. They want to know that you are not going to have, buy twice as big, the biggest house on the block. There is a fabric here. And they proposed to City Council that fabric be maintained through contextual standards, and City Council approved it. So I'm just pointing out, and so some of you said, older neighborhoods are different. Yes, they can be different. And I want to clarify that. Even when we consolidate zone districts in Module 1 and propose them, and they're not set in stone, they are a proposal, it is quite possible to say in neighborhoods established before the effective date of this zoning ordinance, the following rules will apply. And it's usually you will fit in with the fabric. In areas zoned into this afterwards, after the code is adopted, we're more flexible. We don't need to have 2 different districts. We can have one set of standards for alley-loaded older developments, and we could have one set of standards for newer suburban developments that is more flexible or different and less focused on fabric because they're building the fabric. There is no fabric. The developer is creating the fabric. Well, a lot of fabric can work. And so those are 2 trends going on here. Let's take one more slide, Gabby. If we can. Okay. And then the following one is this one. Brad disagrees with this, and that is fine. He's been very articulate in saying it. In general, for the reason I just said, land prices have to be recouped somehow through the development. The trend often around the country is to say, we are going to create, we're going to allow lower lot sizes or lower lot widths. The typical suburban development after the war often runs 70 feet wide, and a lot of codes say 70 feet wide. And that is, in many cases, a front-loaded ranch house with a garage was said, that's a 70-foot lot. But many parts of older cities, and you probably have places in Boise, were platted on 25-foot lots. They were built on 25 or 37-foot wide lots. And a number of newer codes are saying, we are willing to have a zone district that does that because, hey, I mean, look around. That was a perfectly fine neighborhood. People love it. They live in it. It's smaller houses, it's bungalows, it's smaller places. But there's no problem with the lot size. It's not un-American to have a 25-foot lot. Our city was already built this way, so why wouldn't we let people to do that in the future? And so they do not do it in every zone district, but they often are going there, and in some cases going below 25 feet, substantially below 25 feet. So once again, I want to be clear, Boise doesn't have to do any of these things, but you're rewriting your development code for the first time in a while, and you're struggling with affordable housing. And these are some of the things that folks often do when they rethink their development standards, their dimensional standards going forward. So I think we're ready for a break if you are, Andrea.
Yeah, let's go ahead and take a 5-minute break. It looks like it's 4:09 now. So if we could be back at 4:15, that'll give us a really great start and we can get into the presentation a little bit more. See everybody in 5 minutes. All right, we are back. It's 4:15. I hope everybody got a good stretch and a beverage, and we can get started.
Right. I'm assuming even though the cameras are coming on slowly, I'm hoping people make it back. So we have two questions related to this topic. I apologize for those of you who think we're in the weeds. We are in the weeds. That's the nature of this topic is it's very weedy. It'd be nice if it wasn't. We can try to simplify it. Part of our point in the first part of this presentation was it may be weedier than it needs to be. You know, it doesn't need to necessarily have as many controls, but that's what we're trying to flesh out with you folks. But so here's the first of two questions, and I think we'll try to take about 10 minutes on each one of these two questions, and then leave some time over if we want to at the end for public comment and affordable housing. Density, intensity, form. This has come up several times, and this is one of the two, I think, big questions that has people, even people who are going along with the modular approach to drafting, kind of said, well, I sure need to see the next one. I sure need to see density and intensity here. So in addition to setbacks, heights, open space, lot coverage, which are kind of, I call it the invisible box. You got a lot, you got a piece of paper, there's a box you can shape your development within on that lot. And how big is that box related to that lot, basically? What does it have to fit in? Those are de facto form controls. You also regulate by maximum dwelling units per acre in residential zones and maximum floor area ratios in other zones often. And sometimes, so here's the question. Do you need to do it? And here's, the architects probably have strong opinions. The concern is this. We have run onto numerous codes around the country, and I cannot tell you to what degree it's true in Boise yet. We're just starting to write module 2, where the sum total of the development controls we said earlier on a lot would allow you to build a building of a certain size. And the developer says, I could build and market and provide parking for 10 houses in that building. But the dwelling units per acre, when I look at the size of my lot, there's another control on here that says dwelling units per acre. And according to that, I'm only going to be able to build 6 units in this house. That's a perverse thing. Many communities feel that's a perverse thing in the sense that you've just given up 4 dwelling units for character. The guy says, I could have built 10, you're having me build 6. And I could have parked all 10 of them, whatever your parking standards. I could have parked all 10 of them and I could have satisfied the right. So that is one. And then floor area, I won't belabor the point. We made it earlier that it's an interesting tool. It was developed for raw land, but most of Boise is, I mean, you have a raw land development and you will continue to have it, but it is increasingly not used for urban areas for the reasons we've said earlier. So we have 3 hands up already. Andrea, why don't you?
Let's do Byron, followed by Ian, followed by Patrick.
Thanks, Andrea. Thanks, Dawn. I strongly think that both are unnecessary in most zones. I would make an exception, I think, for the large lot zones. Those, and especially when they apply to like a suburban development form, probably do need to follow a one or both of those, A or B, or both. The floor area ratio specifically is over and density is overwhelmingly punishing in small lot development in our current code and has prevented everything down to an ADU from being built. So I would argue against either one of them being necessary, specifically since we have a lot of other levers that we can use to kind of control the density in other ways like setbacks.
Thanks, Byron. Ian.
Yeah, I think I generally agree with what Byron's saying, that in most development, most land uses, maximum dwelling units and maximum floor area ratios are kind of unnecessary. With some caveats, I think when you're getting into multifamily projects, they're always going to be pushing for that max floor area, max dwelling unit, and kind of setting that number purely based off of, a somewhat arbitrary number is difficult, especially when you can make it work, as Don was saying. I do, however, think when we get into some, to address Brad's concerns, when we get into some of these residential neighborhoods, floor area ratios can be beneficial, because then you don't run into McMansions next to, a single family ranch. To be sensitive to that, I think floor area ratios might be beneficial in some zones, I guess is what I'm saying.
If I could respond to that, I wished as soon as we got into this presentation, I had put one more thing up at the front of the presentation, which is that I heard exactly what you said, Ian, and I get it. One of the things that does upset people is when you have an older neighborhood, or a neighborhood that has basically 2-story houses with pitched roofs, and you wind up with box houses with 3 stories that are in the same height limit. They just maxed out the box. And so we should have put out there, and this group should think about, in a number of communities, you could limit it and say you can't build a box that big because our FAR limits you not to do it. Or you could say your roof type needs to be consistent with, if everybody else in the block is building pitched roof buildings, you need to fit in with a pitched roof building. So it could be FAR, but other places have done it through a form control where they say, look, that the whole issue is not the square footage in the building. It's the fact that you're building a type of building that is out of fit with the neighborhood. And so we are going to do that through a form control over the shape of the building. So, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, real quick, to comment on that. I understand how that works, and I do struggle with it, because I don't want to limit design or style or creativity for that matter. But I guess there are ways around that. You can have a regulation for pitched roof and for flat roof buildings in the same zone. So I hear you.
Thank you.
Yes, so we have Patrick, and then we will hear from Richard.
Thanks. I think both of these are unnecessary, and I think it would be a positive step forward for our city if we didn't use these 2 techniques. I think, generally speaking, as Don's kind of alluded to, they are proxies for other things that we care about, and they're kind of a heavy hammer that hits a lot of aspects of development, when we actually have more specific concerns that we address with other tools in the toolbox. And I believe these probably have an abnormally high ratio of unintended consequences to these particular aspects, producing the positive outcomes we want.
All right, Richard, and then Daniel, and then Brad.
Yeah, not to have a trend here of coming on after Patrick and saying the reverse. I don't really understand the second, floor area ratios, the need for them. They do seem, so I haven't put a lot of thought into it. I don't understand them. So I right now could be happy if they don't exist. Density is kind of, it is the catch-all for everything else. And it's the kind of the easiest thing that people understand. And when it comes to, planning for services, schools, sewer, water, et cetera, it's kind of the most obvious thing. And that is just a very straightforward measure. I agree. It doesn't say everything. But I would have a really hard time seeing a successful code that had no density maximums. I guess I'll just leave it at that.
Okay.
All right, Daniel.
Yeah, I think I agree with Patrick on both. That I think we could achieve our objectives without having without using these, and having contextual based or whatever other tools we've talked about today. Don, one thing I do think about though is is Boise, is as we start creating these. I mean, you've talked a lot about like maintaining neighborhood character, and I know that's been something that has been I think the mayor has said she wants to, like that's one objective of this, but we also know that neighborhoods change, and that they don't do we want to expect Boise to look exactly like, have the same character 100 years from now? Probably not. I mean, this isn't going to be a 100-year code, but I just wonder, because this is sort of a once in a generation shot, how do you think about that? And so if you say we've been layering on, too many tools to try to guide things, that we could come up with a more sensible form, but I'm fine with using different tools than FAR and dwellings per unit if we can, but I'm just wondering about how do we kind of get to that? Yeah, we want it to be, roughly consistent, but we're trying to basically expand the box and make it clear what you can do within these. And so how do you think about allowing for change in neighborhoods?
Well, there are two short answers to that. And again, there's a balance of change and stability. That's what we're having this discussion for. That's why we've asked these questions. What does it matter to you? There are two general things that cities often talk about. One is this: is the sum total of the setbacks, the lot coverage, the open space, and the lot width size, is it too conservative? Could we change that? And many places do, because they have people coming in for variances. I want a variance to put an addition on the back of my house. And the answer is, oh, you're up against your lot coverage. You're going to have to go get a variance. And after a while, staff says, this is happening regularly. One answer is to allow more of the piece of paper to be built on. So that is one of them. And the other one is to say, but let's put a limit on that so that when we look at those things and we say, that's not very different than its neighbors, we could accept that amount of physical change in here. The second part is what we've put out in Module 1. And if you fit into that, what Module 1 essentially says is, in the low density residential neighborhoods, if you fit into that fabric, you can do 2 or 3 units in this building. So the change is allowed by occupancy and by the different uses that are allowed to allow the city to evolve. So part of it is how much is too little, how much is too physical change. And you're exactly right. Most places, if a new house was torn down and built and it was a nice house, people wouldn't even ask, is that a 5-foot setback or a 4-foot setback or a 3-foot setback or a 7-foot setback? They don't ask it. It fits in. And so it's a combination of some degree of physical change and some degree of use, flexibility. And frankly, in the end, we take all the comments we've gotten back, at least I predict this is what the city will do, and say, which of these get us closer to Blueprint Boise, which does say we're going to do both. It's a general answer, but that's kind of the process we're going through right now. That's why we're spending a whole session trying to draw you out on this. I agree with whoever said it earlier. Neighborhood character is very important, but I'm not going to let you get away with that. What do you mean by neighborhood character? Height, roof shape, backyards, front yards, side yards, lot coverage, open space. What matters? Because that's where we can find the flexibility to let Boise change while making people say, I can live with that degree of change in my neighborhood. So.
All right, we have 2 more hands. So we have Brad and then Shellen.
Yeah, I think everybody's getting the impression I don't like people, but it's really beside the point. What I'm here for is to save the neighborhoods that are existing. I live in a place where I have a half acre. It is a lower income area. At least in the past it has been. What I worry about, and of course I worry about my area because that's where I live. I'm worried about, since it's a half acre, that we can put 2 or 3 houses in there, and which will change the character of the neighborhood. As Roberta said in comments there, if people want to live on top of each other, in apartments, if that's how you want to live, if you want to live in a tight neighborhood, that's great. Buy there. But I bought where I bought because I like the character. Now, if somebody wants to knock one of them old houses down and put a single house back in it, great. I'm all for that. But put 3 houses in there, 2 houses in there, that changes the whole dynamic of the neighborhood. besides losing the value of the neighbors around it.
Well said.
All right, and Shellen.
Yeah, hi. I think most of my comments have already been made in the chat, but yeah, I guess I would just agree with, or have been previously made, I would agree with those that suggested that either maximum dwelling units and maximum floor area ratios aren't necessary. I don't think that they do what they intend to do, especially when you think about unit size, number of bedrooms. And one person made the comment about, making density a tool for planning in regards to infrastructure in schools. And I think there's other ways to do that outside of just a density number. So I just, I think I just don't think that tool does what it says it's going to do, and it doesn't protect character. I say that in air quotes because I don't know what really protect character means, but that's my 2 cents.
Thank you. We have had a lot in the chat for those who aren't watching the chat, and for the public. There's a good bit of additional information and feedback being given in the chat. So can we move on? Let's do this so we can keep moving if that's okay. Let's go on to the next one. That was just another. Last question for the focus question before we, if we have time, open it up for more on affordable housing, et cetera. Height and transitions. So once again, we've said, and some of you know that I was privileged to talk to City Council about this a couple nights ago in a briefing just to let them know how it was going. And they're very well aware. There's a tension in Blueprint Boise between saying new development has to fit in and allowing taller buildings to accommodate sustainable, efficient, responsible growth. So how should you resolve that tension? The poster child of this is a street frontage on a collector street, not the biggest street in Boise, a medium size, but it's not a local street. It's got traffic on it and it's zoned for commercial. And if you walk down it, there was a lot of single story auto-oriented buildings. I mean, you drive in, you drive out, you get your donuts or you get your shopping, you do it, or you go to your dentist's office, but they're not centers. Blueprint Boise talks a lot about centers. We have talked a lot about centers. Module 1 includes centers, but there are other commercial areas that are linear and they often are only a block or half a block deep. Once you get behind that facade of commercial or office, you're into residential neighborhoods, and that edge between low density residential neighborhoods and higher and the value of mixed use development along the street is a difficult question. Well, the way we sometimes say it is most people agree, and Blueprint Boise says both of those are true. We do want more development along the streets, mixed use development, more walkable, street oriented. In the centers, it reinforces transit, but this is where you could put multifamily development that doesn't disturb the single family neighborhoods. But how do you get from 2 or 3 story buildings, for the sake of discussion today, down to single family houses, which are often right behind them or very close to them? And right now it's not an issue because they're 1 story buildings along the street, but in many plans and including Blueprint Boise, it says, no, but that's not, we don't think that ought to be 1 story building. We have zoned it and we anticipate it for being taller. So next slide, which is our last one, I think. Gabby, yeah. So one of the tools that is often included is simply a step down, a set of things, bigger setbacks from on your left is a single family house. In this drawing, it's a story and a half. Then there is a commercial building and then there's a taller commercial building to the right. And many newer codes just say, we don't need to have a debate every time this happens. Usually in a single family zone, you are allowed to build a two story house. And that's about 35 feet if you do a 2-story pitched roof house. Sometimes it's lower, occasionally it's higher, but for the sake of discussion, it's 35 feet. And often the short answer to this question is where you back up against single family neighborhoods, you need to have a bigger setback. And for some distance next to the property line, that vertical line next to the house, your building can't be any taller than that house, basically 35 feet. And then it can get taller to the 2 or 3 stories that you have. Now, this is tricky on shallow lots because sometimes that really makes it hard. It's only a half a block deep. There's not a lot of building area there before you run into the single family neighborhoods. But this is one example of height step downs and additional setbacks. And sometimes there are restrictions on driving lanes and parking right next to the house. But I guess and the picture is a real picture. It's from Denver. It's a few blocks from my house where there are 35-story old Denver houses, but the street, busy street on the right, was zoned for 3-story buildings. So what do you do? And this is just a visual graphic of what they did. They had to build something the size and height of a house in the area of the lot closest to the house, and then they could go to the maximum height that the zoning allowed along the busy street. We'll just throw it out there. This is not the answer. This is to help you visualize this edge condition and the way some cities are trying to think about it. But I'd love to hear anybody's thoughts about this. This is how do you protect the neighborhoods? Go ahead.
So Byron and then Chris.
Sorry for raising my hand every time. Don, I just have a quick clarification question. So are any other areas looking at incremental changes? So, allowing a structure next to a 2-story structure or a 1-story structure to be 1 story higher if it changes, if it gets redeveloped or whatever. Does that fall under contextual standards, under that definition, allowing incremental changes through a neighborhood to allow the market to kind of dictate where the highly desirable properties are and let them densify over time? Does that make sense?
Yes, I understand your question. As a matter of fact, years ago, I wrote a book on zoning, and we had a chapter on that called Dynamic Development Standards. You could do it. It gets a lot of discussion. Very few cities approve it for height. They do. The times I've seen it used, it's around downtown. Downtown's tall. The area around downtown is not just a commercial area. It's going to be medium tall, but we don't have a number in mind. And the neighbors around are concerned. And so I have seen it done, but to be honest, it's very rare.
Theoretically, would it be successful near activity centers in theory?
It could. What you have to think through is how the market will respond. If they think that eventually, let's just use a simple example. The houses are only 2 stories. The zoning says you can go to 4 stories. And the code says, well, first building out that's nearby has to go to 3 stories. And then the next guy can go to 4 stories. Does the market respond by waiting? Does it not do? Because they think if they just wait long enough for someone else to take the bait, they will get to be a builder building. So it is the kind of the unknown consequences of whether that will spur development that is more compatible. And by the time people are used to a 3-story building in the activity center, then they probably wouldn't worry if the next building was a 4-story building, or will it result in nobody doing anything because they're waiting to get a 4-story building?
All right, we have Chris, followed by Shellen, followed by Richard.
So I want to thank you for that visual and some of the discussions about the transition areas. That was something that I was sort of playing around in my head, but this gave a little bit more of a concrete understanding that I think is helpful, especially for the transit corridors where, if we want to build up mixed use housing along State Street, but, the next block is residential, what are some of the options for that? And I think that sort of helped with that. But I'm also thinking that, as the city is growing, we can't control how many people are moving here. So there is going to need to be an increase in density. And in some areas, there is going to need to be a building of up and not just out. Having height of building increases is something that I feel like is going to be necessary, especially in some of those downtown areas. And so especially the downtown corridor, this is where I get questions about what a transitional area actually ends up looking like. So for instance, there's a pending building at 4th and Idaho where the current ICCU branch is, and it was argued to be too tall for the area. And I used to live right across from that lot, so I know the area very well. And right within a block of in each direction of that proposed building, there's a 7 and an 8-story residential building already there, but people were saying that a 9-story building was going to be too tall and that it wasn't going to work in that area because it's peripheral to downtown, when I think a lot of people would argue that that's still the downtown sort of corridor. So sort of deciding like what is that transitional area, what happens when we're working on things like infill. We're seeing, you know, all the development along Front and Myrtle that's already building up to 4 and 5 stories. And if we're going to sort of fill in the rest of those areas in downtown, like there should be options for height in that area. But then what does it look like on the other side of Broadway from downtown, or what does it look like on the other side of St. Luke's or on the other side of the Capitol building? And what would those transitions actually end up looking like?
Now there's not only the paradigm I showed you, commercial strip of a 3-story building down to a residential. There are more significant transition areas in the areas around downtown. You're right, exactly. And some of zoning is line drawing, and others, as was just mentioned a minute ago, is that sometimes the lines can be fuzzy. They can depend on what's going on around you in terms of how much or what you're allowed to do. That you can write those kind of standards. Shellen? Oh, I don't know who's next. Sorry.
Shellen.
Okay.
Oh, I just had a question for, I think you, Dawn, or Gabby. In those areas that you see that required kind of setback, like you showed in the image, Denver, I think it was, do you find that all of the new development looks the same? I kind of share the concern that an architect said earlier, is when you create that specificity in the code, you have like 10 or 15 years where every new building looks the same. It's 3-story within a 2-story, 15-foot area. And I just thought from a uniqueness and creativity perspective, there may be a better way.
Well, Shellen, the short answer is development happens, as you know, gradually over time. So let's imagine that law was in place in Boise. You know, you're going to have developers come forward as they get financing or as buildings want to do to build the 3-story buildings along the commercial corridor. It won't all happen at one time. You're right. 20 years from now, would you have 3-story buildings along the corridor? Yes, if you allow 3-story buildings. Usually the step down that I was, that the step down doesn't affect the uniformity. Either your design standards allow them to vary if you've written them right along the building itself. But if it's a valuable corridor and it allows 3-story zoning, you're probably going to get 3-story buildings. Whether it looks boring and monotonous has to do with your design standards, which we'll talk about later. But in terms of the back of the building, that all the buildings step down when they are backing up against residential development. You know, my experience is most places who have adopted this like it. It works because it's a compromise, not because of the when you look, you can imagine looking down an alley where the right side was commercial and the left side was backyards of houses. People are pretty happy with the fact that the part of the building that is near their residential property is not taller than what they had. And to be honest, they're not that concerned about what the back of those commercial buildings looks like. It is a political compromise that, yes, it's going to densify, and yes, the part of it that is closest to you will not overshadow you. And so I think your question really is about the street frontage. And I think that has more to do with design standards than it does. I mean, if you allow 3-story heights and it's valuable land, you're probably going to get 3-story buildings in the end.
Yeah, no, I have no doubt that, you know, especially as land and rents continue to rise, maximizing whatever will occur. The market will drive that. Absolutely. I guess I'm just thinking that step down seems like it seems like that's a way a lot of communities are going. And I was thinking there needs, in my very small mind, it seems like there needs to be more options than just a straight step down, because it starts to look boring.
Okay. Well, that's something we can look into, see if there are varieties of that we're not aware of that would address it.
I'm thinking roof pitch and dormers, that kind of stuff.
Yep. Okay. All right. Good thought.
All right. We have Richard.
Yeah, thanks. So our neighborhood about 4 or 5 years ago kind of had a huge battle. I was only peripherally involved. I was more involved with a waste incinerator that was also proposed for our neighborhood. But with a big complex, which would be kind of more typical out here, apartment complex of 400 or 500 units or so. And after a 2 or 3 year battle, this was kind of the compromise that came about. And it's still for other, for many reasons, in part because of the battle, hated by anybody who lives around the area, and also just because it's ugly. But that's all other issue. But I do think that the step downs really did help a lot. It doesn't solve everything, though. What I hear from people is what you mentioned: privacy was a big deal. However, so the residential area, the existing residential area was on the north side. And so that is different here in the Northern Hemisphere, roughly at 45 degrees latitude. It does make a difference, right? Whether or not that's to the north of you or to the south of you in terms of sun. And I know it's maybe not a popular view among some, but I think access to sunlight is pretty dang important. And so maybe there should be a difference between on what side of the, if you're talking north or south exposures. So yes, I think it would help if this was built into the code to begin with, so it didn't have to come about after a huge battle. Two, though, I still hear a lot of issues, and they're more about kind of the, anecdotally, half the people who lived along the nearby street, the closest street, have sold their houses and moved away, after the first year or so. I can't confirm that, but of the new apartment complex being built. But I do hear a lot of complaints about people coming out of the apartment building, walking their dogs, and crapping on people's lawns and things like that. So it doesn't fully resolve the tension between these very different kinds of land uses. And then just one other quick point: I see the phrase "established neighborhood" put out there a lot, and I just want to say that's a little bit of a trigger out here. Most of my neighborhood is not considered an established neighborhood because our ratio of land values, I should say built value over land value, is below a certain threshold, which means we're not established, even though, our neighborhoods are some of the oldest in Boise. And we, generations go back with families. So I'm not sure what we mean when we're talking about established neighborhoods, but that is something I just want to throw out there. It's a term of contention for us. Thank you.
No, that's helpful to know. It's hard to say you're in pot A or pot B. That may be too simplistic a way to look at it, and those designations could be controversial.
Yeah. And Drew has provided a comment. He's having some bad internet quality, so he has chatted. Is this transitional strategy based on a majority of nearby uses? For example, if only one single-story home is nearby a transition area, does that one home take priority?
The short answer is, as I tried to introduce this, I'm happy to talk about it, but there aren't a lot of examples out there about it. If you're asking how do people do it, the example I can think of was they said, look, your height as in this area, this was not next to a single family residential, but there were residential neighborhoods near downtown, there was downtown, and this was kind of the ring around downtown. So it was already not a low density area. And they said, take a look at your property and the tallest building within 500 feet of you. Well, a lot within 500 feet of you, you can build that tall, +1. That's what they said. So it's not a ratchet down effect, guys. I think it's been said 2 or 3 times, and I think this group has a very good understanding, I think. It can't be, what if everybody in the neighborhood has built a 2-story house, but one person has a bungalow? That bungalow is not neighborhood character. That can't be true. Same thing the other way around. If everybody has a bungalow and one guy's built a 2-story house because he had a right to, that doesn't make neighborhood character. So I would rather, Drew's asked a very good question, but it's a theoretical question. Very few cities do this, and every way of drafting it I can think of would have questions like this that would breed other questions like this. So it would breed other questions like this. And so if we decide to go that way, I'm happy to have the conversation, but I don't want to mislead people. This is not in common use around the country. This was not, I want to be very clear. The question Andrea just read is not about the step downs behind commercial uses. It was about the earlier question about whether the heights could depend upon prior development and could change as development in the area took. So I want to be clear that my last explanation had nothing to do with the height step downs. It had to do with dynamic development standards in which what you can build depends on what's been built around you. So.
All right, we have a hand raised by Brad, and then I want to make sure that we're giving our attendees an opportunity to participate as well, should they choose to.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a little quick point or idea. As far as the zoning, maybe it's a little off subject, but loosening up restrictions on zoning, I think is a bad idea. I think that maybe we should strengthen them, but have an avenue of discussion. I'm sure there's a term for that. I don't know what it is, but you know, I don't mind being able to discuss an idea, but just opening the door for anything, that's a scary idea.
Okay.
All right. So we actually have two attendees, and I don't know, Lisa or a telephone caller that's unidentified. Do either one of you wish to speak or give your thoughts or ideas or recommendations to us as a committee? Anyone?
Are they unmuted, or do they have to raise their hand, or how do they indicate if they would?
They can raise their hand, or I have unmuted. Oh, I guess I do. I have Lisa Reed who would like to ask a question. So Lisa, go ahead.
Yeah, Andrea, hi. And thank you for acknowledging the participants. I'm looking for my notes, sorry. But my question was more along, or my thinking is more along the fact that, you know, these previous codes lasted for 55 years. We know that climate change is a big issue for us. And I'm just wondering about how we build into the zoning codes the flexibility so that our city can be nimble in order to, as more science comes along, as we learn more, as more technology comes along, that we can implement practices that help fight climate change. Thank you.
It's a great question. Can I try to answer that, Andrea?
Absolutely.
Or do you want to answer? Okay.
Go ahead.
So the short answer is that is one reason why newer codes try to allow more flexibility. With the caveat, we have had 2 hours of discussion, which is a follow-on to others about, okay, at what point does change run into neighborhood character? So we need to find that balance. But in general, technology changes, building types change, and the climate is changing faster than people can do this once in a 10 or 20 year rewrite of their development codes. And so building in flexibility is one of just the basic philosophies behind zoning these days, because we don't actually know what adjustments are going to be necessary in order to accommodate climate change. And that means also the flooding impacts and the drainage impacts and the storm impacts and the fire impacts. And so, among other things. So flexibility that's one of the reasons codes have become less rigid, because we are not as smart about the future as we thought we were. The second thing is we have tried to do, when we've written codes for a couple decades now, trying to get at sustainability and how do you deal and adapt to climate change, and frankly, reduce the emission of greenhouse gases that is growing and raising the temperature of the earth. And so there are about 5 things. You allow renewable energy facilities, and you allow more of them in places where, in more properties, backyard solar, backyard wind in commercial areas and industrial. You have increased connectivity and walkability. So more things can be done by the bike, or if you're in a car with a shorter car trip, or maybe you can walk. So connectivity, mixed use, because if people don't have to live near where they work, But if they want to live near where they work, most cities come to the conclusion that would be a good thing to allow them that option. So more mixed use. Fourth is basically urban agriculture, allowing more places in the community to produce food locally so that less of it has to be transported and more of it can be grown and consumed locally. And the fifth, which is not usually in zoning codes, is really trash and recycling. So of course you allow it. Sometimes you include uses that allow the recycling industry to reuse more materials. So you can transport fewer materials in and reuse more of them so that you don't have to, you can reduce vehicle emissions from those kinds of things. Those five, I'm happy to go into more detail, but when you think about what zoning can do, there are about 5 or 6. If you had pressed me, I could come up with 7. But those are the things that zoning can do. And we have tried to do that in Module 1. We will continue to try to do it in the other 2. For example, next time around, we're going to be talking, among other things, about connectivity. How much bicycle, car, and walking connectivity should Boise require to let you get there with a shorter trip, regardless of how you're getting there? That's a climate change issue. And that's going to come up in the next meeting. So.
And then just to add on that as well, I think, putting personal and property safety is also an important one. So we certainly have issues with the Boise River as well as our foothills, creating flooding or fire issues that can occur because of those. So protecting those and making sure that we are building away from those is a really good way for us to be a little bit forward thinking about some of those things. And then also we hear a lot about replenishing our aquifer. So making sure that we have those open spaces that are necessary or utilizing less water. So whether that is through alternative landscaping, water capture, using gray water, those type of things are also possible as well. And then even, I've had people say, how can I think about things in a forward thinking way? And so I say, today we often have gas stations that we hear people complain about because there's fumes and there's noise and those types of things. As we transition to electric vehicle, a use might be appropriate to be different, and where we locate an electric vehicle charging facility or convenience store versus one that is actually serving fuel, those types of things. And so just thinking forward about how things could change, how our technologies can change and how uses, and really making sure that buildings can adapt over time as well. So we've had a lot of conversations about adaptive reuse, or we're not seeing big boxes. People are now transitioning to purchasing online. So are there ways that we can make that housing? Are there ways that we can make that, smaller retail facilities? So just being adaptive and as you had described, Lisa, nimble is a great way for us to think about things as we move forward. And then would the other caller like to speak or address our committee?
I would. Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay. My name is John. I just had 2 very specific comments. One of them was the definition of MXA, Mixed Use Activity Center. It references Blueprint Boise as the basis for inclusion in that district. And I think just as a general rule, if you want to make this whole process simpler, more simple, that referencing Blueprint Boise should be as limited as possible. I mean, it's a fairly substantial document that also incorporates by reference 68 other plans. So it's one way for development to be challenged is just go back to Blueprint Boise and say, well, the zoning doesn't agree with Blueprint Boise, you can't do this. The other thing about that definition is it defines MXA as being, if you're located near a mapped activity center in Blueprint Boise, which is a highly subjective term. And I don't know if that can be dialed in. That actually does affect me on one specific property, and I would be interested in what near means, or if there's a definition somewhere else in the code that I missed. But I think more specificity would be good there. The other thing that I had to add, and I'm sure everybody wants to get home, one of the committee members referenced the ADU section. I had given Andrea comments on the ADU section. I think that requirement for the owner of the property to live on the property as part of a condition of development for the ADU is the only place in the code where development rights are limited or granted by whether the owner occupies the property or not. I can't think of anywhere else on the commercial side or the residential side. And I'm not even sure that it's legal. But that aside, the practical enforcement of that, once the ADU is built, say, for example, if somebody's grandmother were to build an ADU and then leave it to the family, and nobody particularly wanted to occupy that property, so is the family then left to dispose of the property and then dispose it to a limited group of buyers, limited by code, because investors can't buy that property unless one of the owners wants to use it. And then the other thing I'd say to that is it doesn't really recognize modern ownership structures like LLCs and family trusts and such, where ownership may not be entirely clear and who is eligible to be an owner. It would be fairly easy to include a tenant resident as an LLC member for the duration of their tenancy, and then write them out when they vacate. So I really think that should be written out of the code. It seems so unworkable and so unfair to property investors. And the data that Andrea was going to send out may not indicate the number of investors who haven't built because of that. And I'm one of them. I would like to build an ADU but can't or don't choose to at this point because the deed restriction has to be recorded on the property for essentially for eternity if the ADU is built. So long comments. That's all I had to say. Thank you.
Those are helpful. Andrea, can I respond to the first one if I could, just so everybody's on the same page here? He's right that when in some of those purpose statements, which are really not regulatory, but they're descriptive in module 1 about his example was MXA. We've included it because it helps people read it in the absence of a map. When the conversion maps are in discussion, once we get through module 2 and we have at least the 2 substantive parts of this and maps out there where people are going to look at it, the city's going to have to identify those things. So that language, that vague language, near or in Blueprint Boise, because this code may last longer than Blueprint Boise is the relevant map, relevant plan of the city. That is to help readers now. I do agree with him that in general that's probably pretty vague, but by the time we get to the end of this process, there will be a map accompanying it, and the intended areas for MXA will be clear. So he's right.
Yes, so we have reached our 5 p.m., which is actually the end of our meeting, but there was a really good discussion that was occurring before the meeting that was happening via email. And I just wanted to take a poll, would people like to, take the next 10 minutes to really talk about some of those things? And because I think that there are some things that we should point out, specifically that we need to differentiate between general affordability and then income restricted affordability. That's really important. As far as income restricted, when you're subsidizing housing, there's not a lot that you can do through the zoning code. Ultimately, you can be flexible with some of your standards in regard to parking or density or height and some of those things if we're talking about general affordability. But when we talk about subsidies, we are really going to have to focus on some of the city's other facets. And I don't know if many of you have been following, but the mayor has an extreme interest, and she has made a priority for her to provide affordable housing, and is looking at land trusts that can purchase property and that can help build those types of homes for everyone throughout our city. And she's kicked off a very large campaign. If you followed in the news, she's actually created a number of positions that are going to help facilitate that. And so we do have to lean on other facets. The zoning code can do a lot of things as far as affordability and creating opportunity for people. So I really think it's important for us to focus on the things that the zoning code can do. So we can incentivize things through, density, additional height, those types of things. We saw that when we created the housing bonus ordinance. There are some other ways to do that as well. But even looking at the price of housing as far as rentals or purchasing, it's important that we can reduce costs other ways. So if we can save people money on transportation, that is a really important way for them to be able to save some funds so that they can actually use that for housing or for groceries or healthcare needs, things that they need. We can also attract, high quality businesses to make our economy grow. And those businesses then create good jobs that provide high paying salaries, they provide benefits, those types of things. We need to be attracting those people. We need to be encouraging people and giving them access to educational opportunities, whether it's schools or training programs. All of those types of things help contribute to making people have affordable wages to where they can afford housing, they can afford transportation, and they can support the services that are in their town and their city. So I just want everybody to think big and think globally, and us as a community when we think about affordability. We're really looking to provide housing for everybody at every income. Not specifically our low income, although they are a key component to our society, and we do find them important. But we need to think about everybody as well. So, did anybody else have anything that they wanted to share or follow up? Because I think it's an important topic that we really talk about what the zoning code can and cannot do.
Can I since you've opened this up, and I see a chat comment that people would like to spend some time with this at a future meeting, and I think that probably was a good thing. This is a really complicated project, complicated problem, challenge. But this group has committed to meeting to work through a lot of complicated stuff, and this is what let me just see if I have this available. If people would bear with me for just a couple of minutes, if I had this available, I would share a document with you very quickly. Just give me a second here. I think I can do this. And I apologize for the time. I thought I had it pulled up already, but I can do it here quickly, I think. Okay.
Are you looking for that graphic?
Yep. Yeah, you want to share it?
I think I got it.
Okay, why don't you share it? This is a very simple graphic, but I do think it's very helpful to know. The green arrow is what the market can provide. Obviously that changes, but it's a lot of things in that box are out of our control. Construction prices, land prices, materials prices, labor prices. The dark part of that bar, the gray bar, tends to be the lower income basis, and the market can provide a lot of housing. That's who provides most of the housing in America. When you get to the gray bar, it is harder for the market to provide it. I view what zoning can do is looking at the overlap between the gray bar and the green bar and saying, if we changed zoning, we could allow the market to do more on the left-hand side. It could extend that green arrow to the left. And that would allow the money, because most of the time, the housing for the gray bar areas, very low income, and as the email chatter before this session was pointing out, even 100% AMI, moderate income, up to that level, is often takes some form of money. Now, where the gray and the green overlap is an area where incentives or bonuses or parking reductions or changes in zoning can help the market do what would otherwise require subsidies. And that's a lot of what's being talked about here. Because when you get off the left end of that green arrow, regardless of, even if we push it to the left further, when you get off the left end of that green arrow, you're going to need money, real money, or fake money called tax benefits. But you can't do it through zoning. The subsidies involved in trying to get down to that level are just too great. You can't increase the prices on your market units to subsidize the low income units enough to make it work. Now, I see the hands going up, so people may really disagree with this, but I find this a helpful way to think about it. The market doesn't need any help doing the green arrow to the right. The market could do more of the green and gray overlap if we fix zoning. Zoning cannot do the very left end of this arrow. It needs tax credits, it needs loans, it needs free land, it needs housing trusts, it needs whatever. So I will stop talking, but I think when people think about this, I sometimes find the conversation is somewhat confused between the gray and the green overlap, which zoning can do. And we don't know exactly where that is, except we're trying to make it bigger. And the stuff that requires heavy duty subsidies. That it's helpful to keep in your mind the difference between those two situations, because there's a lot of things zoning just can't do as a matter of economics. So, yep.
And we have hands from Shellen and Richard. Shellen, you want to go ahead?
Well, yeah, I think this is such a big issue, and I don't know that it is something that zoning can or should be solving really, but I wholeheartedly agree with Dawn, and your image is good. I would just urge people to look at what I'm calling the Boise spectrum of needs, because it dials Dawn's image down to the city of Boise. And it does have more information, and maybe when you first look at it, it can be overwhelming. I'm happy to walk through it if anyone's interested at another time or separately. But in this market, our market is producing units, whether it's attached or detached, whether it's for sale or for rent. The lowest it's going down to currently is 100% AMI. So we cannot build housing without money, and it's not in property tax. Roberta mentioned in the taxes, it's not in a property tax decrease. It's in a low income housing tax credit, which is the number one way that affordable, capital A, affordable units are built in this country. Over $8 billion in credits are given to people who have a huge tax burden. Think Google, think Citibank, think retirement, think banks mostly have these needs for credits. And as the tax rate increases at a corporate level, the need for tax credits serving the 60% AMI and below also increases. So that's a good thing, I would say, for affordable housing. But that piece between 80 and 120% AMI cannot be achieved. It is not bankable. It is not feasible without substantial policy and or money to create it. You simply can't pay your mortgage. So Don, I agree. I would just say update it for Boise. And
I was going to say the number you disagree with. The numbers are wrong for Boise. The concept is right. So go ahead.
Right.
Perfect. Thanks, Shellen. How about Richard, and then followed by Daniel?
Yeah. So Shellen and I had a little back and forth there in the email, and I will like to look at those numbers, because what I'm hearing reported from my neighborhood is new units more around 90% for apartments AMI, and that is important because where we set those thresholds for incentives. If we set them above what's already being built, of course, then they don't help, and in my opinion have negative consequences. But to the larger point, I think zoning is incredibly important when it comes to affordable housing. And in one of the major ways is the influence on our existing more affordable housing stock. And that is largely in that gray area, right? My neighborhood has a fair number of manufactured home communities that have been there, some of them since the 60s or whatever, well integrated. And those are affordable compared to anything else. They have problems. and that, people tend to get kind of trapped at times in their manufactured home if they need to move and they cost $10,000 to move, et cetera. That's another issue to talk about with tiny houses, that perhaps, and whether or not they really need to be on foundations. But zoning, by increasing the density, of course, increases the land value, upzoning that is, and therefore puts more affordable housing more at risk. And so I do think it is important to keep that in mind. A fellow by the name of Patrick Condon, who came to Boise a couple of decades ago at the request of Idaho Smart Growth, came back a couple of weeks ago, this time at the request of Vanishing Boise. And he's just written a book. He's from Vancouver. And he said he used to be a big proponent of density for affordability reasons. And now he says, looking at what he has seen, he supports density for other reasons, but in terms of just simply affordability, it just hasn't worked in Vancouver, at least, and where he has looked. Because as you increase the number of allowed units, per acre, your land prices go up accordingly. So anyway, I just wanted to throw that out there. That is directly relevant to, of course, zoning. So thanks.
And Daniel, let's follow up.
Yeah, so obviously this is a contested area, and this is something that, I think there's a lot of evidence that, and Don, if you put your figure back up again, that actually, adding market rate housing, the solution to affordability is to increase the supply of housing. This is sort of Econ 101. And what we've done is our zoning code has constrained the supply of housing inside of Boise. And what we're trying to do is figure out how to relax that constraint in a way so we can build more housing, so that more housing pencils. And what's really important for people to understand is that when you build market rate housing, is you're creating vacancies elsewhere in the market. And there was a study I'm happy to share where they looked at 55,000 new market rate units and followed the chain of vacancies. Right? Because somebody's got to move into that. And where did they move from? And so what they discovered is for every 100 units of market rate housing that you built in central cities, you created 70 vacancies in census tracts that were at or below the median income. So so it's just exactly Richard's point is that our existing housing stock is our source of affordable housing. And we can't expect new housing. Very few new units are going to pencil for those folks who are below 80% AMI. What we can do is build enough market rate housing that people will pay for, that the older units become affordable. And I think, so absolutely. The reason I am on this committee is because I believe that we can improve the zoning code and allow and increase the supply of housing here. And that's what's going to address our affordability problem, because we have so many examples of cities that haven't. And we've been doing an experiment across this country. We had some cities who've constrained the housing supply and others that haven't, and you can see the difference. Okay, off my soapbox.
No, I'm, as somebody said in the chat box, it's a very complicated thing. Guys, if this group, I'm glad everybody's willing to stay another 10 minutes to talk about it. We could talk about it for another hours, but you're coming to the table with good studies on both sides of the issue, which is very helpful. So anyway, we will continue it because this issue will not go away, and we need to have as good a discussion as possible, just so that this group is comfortable as we get down the road further here, that to the degree an approach can be found, it is a thoughtful approach that people can agree with as much as possible. So.
Yep, and I think Shellen leaves us with a great quote, really talking that there isn't a silver bullet to create affordable housing. There's not one single thing that's going to do that. It's really a combination of policy, money, through the tax system, subsidies, fee deferrals, density, and really a reduction in some of the barriers that zoning creates. So some of this we are going to be in charge of, but others will be outside of our hands. So let's just keep an open mind and really think about our community and making sure that we have housing for everyone. Oh, and I think that's it. So our next meeting will be on June 17th, and you should be expecting your minutes shortly. And then we've got some research to do for you as well. So we'll see you on June 17th.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.